The Russians were taking their time. Since we had caught the first sounds of their new front, a full day had gone by, but nothing more had happened. Had we possessed sufficient strength and equipment, a counterattack would almost surely have been successful, but our orders were simply to resist and hang on. We were operating on a system of 4 hours on and 4 hours off, organized so that a maximum number of men was in the line at any given moment. Many men fell asleep beside their guns, only to wake suddenly, badly frozen. We were steadily losing sick and wounded men, who withdrew on foot or on horseback. No reinforcements were arriving to fill the gaps. "It's a racket," grumbled the veteran. At dusk we found Lindbergh naked from the waist down. He had gone off a short distance, supposedly to relieve himself, and had stayed that way for nearly 3/4 of an hour. By the time we found him, he was crying like a baby, and he wouldn't have lasted much longer. Howls blew up at him, hitting him on the backside and thighs with the strap of his gas mask. By the next morning, the Russians had still not attacked. We had grown steadily colder and more nervous, and it was difficult to seem calm. One of our planes flew over and dropped 4 sacks of mail. I had 4 letters, 2 from my family and 2 from Paula. All were very out of date, particularly one of the letters from France, which was more than a month old. I devoured Paula's letters, which seemed filled with sadness. She had been sent to a small factory out in the country, some 40 miles from Berlin. She said that life in the capital was no longer possible. What was I supposed to think? What could I imagine? My parents' letter, with the standard 2-line refrain from my father, irritated me by its tone of unjustified complaint. I mentioned this to Weena, who replied, "That's all the French know how to do, complain." My mother's last letter astounded me by its lack of realism. The poor woman begged me to take care of myself, to avoid showing off, to do my duty, but nothing more, to protect myself from meaningless risks. This sort of advice seemed so irrelevant that for a moment I was staggered. I looked up from the letter, yellow against the snow, to the whiteness which veiled the appalling danger threatening us from the east. The pathetic futility of my mother's attitude made my eyes fill with tears. Everyone seemed to be reading a letter whose contents were so unexpected that men far older than I were overcome by emotion. Others jumped to their feet, screaming like madmen. A close relative or friend had been killed in an air raid. "This mail is only upsetting everyone," said a tall fellow next to me, as he looked at a friend who was weeping like a child. It seemed we were to be spared nothing. In the afternoon, some patrols were sent out into the whirling snow. Our command had grown tired of waiting and decided to test the enemy. We heard a few shots, and then the patrols came back, reporting that they'd seen a heavy concentration of Russian materiel. I and my comrades were wakened just before nightfall. With pounding hearts, we ran to our forward positions. The Russian tanks were rolling through the storm, and we could feel the vibration of their treads against the frozen ground. Our anti-tank gunners and men with Panzerfausts kept their eyes glued to their telescopic sights, which they had to wipe continually. A few anti-tank trenches had been dug, but these were ludicrously inadequate both in number and size. We knew that if our anti-tank defences gave way, we were lost, and we nervously clenched our fingers around the anti-tank grenades and magnetic mines which had been distributed. At the pack we were protecting, Ohlensheim, Ballers, Frevich, and others were ready to work the gun. Our visibility had been seriously reduced by falling snow. To the north of us, an SMG had just opened fire. The rumbling of tanks was louder than ever, but the tanks themselves were still invisible. To the north, fighting had already begun, and we could see flashes of light despite the thickly whirling snow and the rapidly growing darkness. Short bursts of anti-tank fire lashed the plain, producing a curious, muffled echo. As the roar of tanks grew louder, we felt our lungs lift. Long flames ran the length of the horizon, while others rose vertically, illuminating at different levels the whirling masses of falling snow. Then the sound of tank engines in full acceleration shattered the night and our eardrums. 5 vaguely defined monsters loomed out of the darkness, rolling parallel to our line of defence. Our anti-tank crew was already firing. Weena calmly steadied the butt of his FM against his shoulder, and I felt myself stiffen with 1,000 indescribable terrors. Flashes of yellow light burst against the lead tank in the group of T-34S, whose turrets were pointed toward our line. 5 shells had already left white traces on the huge machine, which otherwise appeared to be unaffected by the efforts of our anti-tank gunners. A tank was roaring past us, at a distance of about 10 yards. We heard a howling sound, and a shell from a Panzerfaust burst against its side. The monster immediately reduced its speed, and thick black smoke began to seep from every joint to be lashed to the ground by the wind. The hatches opened, clanging back against the heavy metal plates. We could hear shouts and cries, which were quickly drowned by a powerful explosion. The turret disintegrated, leaving fragments of human beings suspended from the shattered metal in colours ranging from purple to gold. But there were no cries of triumph from our position, only the barking voice of our pack. One of our shells hit a joint on the back of a second tank, and it too began to pour smoke. Then the cartridges were running through my fingers. Everyone who escaped from the immobilized tank was shot down without mercy. For a moment we breathed more easily. By now our surroundings were lit by flames, and we were able to see the Russian tanks before they got so close. One of them had actually crossed our lines, and as it drew near us, we could feel our hair stiffening with terror. The anti-tank crew were working as fast as they could. Within 3 seconds, their gun was facing this new threat, and a shell, fired at the earliest possible instant, was bursting against the enemy's front apron. At the moment of impact, the engine stopped and then began to scream as if it had been thrown out of gear. Simultaneously, somewhere to our right, we were aware of 2 brilliant flashes and heard a long drawn-out explosion. Another tank began to fire at us, and large pieces of frozen earth hurtled into the air. I no longer knew what was happening. The tank to our right burst into flames, groaning at all its seams. "Für den Panzerfaust! Sieg Heil! Heil!" someone shouted. Our gunners were now firing at the second tank that had penetrated to our rear, and which seemed to be having mechanical difficulties. Then its left side disintegrated in a prolonged explosion. But our attention was drawn to a hallucinating spectacle farther to the rear. A T-34 had driven over one of our positions, crushing our men under its treads. One of our half-tracks, armed with an anti-tank machine gun, was chasing it from behind, firing as rapidly as it could. Our anti-tank crew was in trouble. Frevich was wounded, perhaps even dead. We fired our machine guns at the Russian monster, which never slackened its speed, but continued to make for its lines as fast as possible. 2 shells fired by other tanks exploded beside our half-track, and a third disintegrated it right in front of us. But the enemy tank, believing it was still pursued, vanished into the whirling snow. The Russian armoured assault was over. It had lasted for about half an hour and had clearly been testing our defences. A certain number of tanks had been disabled or destroyed. Their losses were visibly greater than ours. Unfortunately, these losses counted for nothing compared to the vast armada. Everyone was singing whatever they liked, contributing to the growing uproar. Hals had been twisting my arm to sing something in French, and I obliged, despite a growing desire to vomit, adding sombre et meuse, and a series of more or less obscene songs to the general discord. Hals, who was as tight as a drum, burst out laughing and shouted, "Here come the Franzosen to the rescue! Ura pobieda!" Then something disagreeable happened. Lenson stood up, stiff with drunkenness. "Who the hell is talking about the Franzosen? What can anyone expect from a bunch of lousy milquetoasts like that?" He was shouting at Hals, who was dancing heavily like a bear. Hals grabbed him by the arm and tried to pull him into a waltz. "Shut up, you idiot!" Lenson yelled. "Go stick your head in the snow instead of belching out such crap." Hals, who was almost a head taller, kept dancing. Then Lenson hit him with his fists, shouting louder than his minuscule superiority of rank gave him any right to. "Stillgestanden, Gefreiter!" he yelled. "Who the hell do you think you are? Are you telling me to shut up?" Hals was trying to stare at Lenson through eyes clouded by drink. "Stillgestanden," Lenson repeated, "or I'll give you something you won't like." "But you're forgetting Sager," Howells shouted, waving at me. By now he was purple-faced too. "He's half French, and he's lived in France all his life. And anyway, the French are with us now." He'd obviously been reading the same stories I had. "You damned fool! Where the hell did you get that?" "But it's true!" someone else shouted. "I read it in Ostfront." I no longer knew which way to look. "Wake up, you dummkopf! So what if a handful of those milksops have come over to us? It doesn't mean a damn thing, and anyone who thinks anything different is no better than they are. Goddamned black-haired guitarists whining over their goddamned love gongs." I knew that Lenson was talking about the fundamental discord which has always existed between South Germany and Prussia. "You're forgetting, Lenson, that my mother grew up just outside Berlin," I said. "Well then, you've got to choose. Either you're German like us, or you're one of those worthless, feckless frogs." I was on the point of saying that after all I didn't really have much choice. And you were asked to make just that choice in Poland, even at Chemnitz. I remember. I was there. "But he did choose," Howells shouted. "And here he is, in the same boat as you and me and all the rest of us." So he doesn't have any more goddamn connection with the French. Lenson, who was unquestionably brave, had been awarded the Iron Cross after destroying his 7th tank. I suddenly felt overwhelmingly depressed and vulnerable, and incapable of ever attaining anything like Lenson's record. As always, I found the war almost totally paralyzing, probably because of my soft French blood, which Lenson despised so much. I was really almost as bad as Lindbergh. He wasn't a true German either, but came from somewhere near Lake Constance, one of Lenson's typical black hairs. A joyous group had begun to sing Marienka, and general drunken revelry took over again. This time, though, I stayed on the sidelines, sunk in thought. All the pride I had felt when I had sworn my oath at Camp F, all my joy in feeling that at last I was the equal of my companions, for whom I felt an unquestioning respect, all the struggles and miseries undertaken and endured with the burning faith of a true believer. All of these had been once again cast into doubt by Lenson's drunken outburst. I had always sensed a certain scorn on his part. However, once in Poland he had come to my defence, and I had jumped to the conclusion that he held nothing against me on account of my origins. Now I knew the truth. Despite all my efforts and all the suffering we had been through together, my comrades rejected me. Would they ever think me worthy of bearing German arms? Inwardly, I cursed my parents for having brought me into the world at their particular crossroads. I felt angry and sad and incredibly alone. I knew that I could count on Hals and Wiener and maybe a few others, but even they had started drinking and singing again beside their blood brothers. I would never again be able to sing with a light, casual spirit those German songs I enjoyed so much. And someday, maybe very soon, I might die, in a position not much better than that of an adoring black slave at his master's side. This vision of things was unbearable and increased the nausea brought on by alcohol. I went outside to vomit and take a few breaths of icy air. My drunkenness prevented any further thought, and when I returned to the hut, I collapsed onto a heap of packs, scratching at the lice biting me under my belt. The next morning, the Russian front began to move again. First, they sent over a few rounds of artillery. They had been keeping us in a state of expectation for several days now, undoubtedly preparing a definitive offensive with the slowness characteristic of their organisation. During the day, we were reinforced by an artillery column, which meant digging new trenches and blistered hands for all of us. All along the front, our troops were ordered to break up the Russian positions. That afternoon, we pounded the enemy with our big guns. They remained obstinately quiet. As soon as it was dark, certain sections loaded with ammunition left our trenches and advanced across the snowy ground. We had resumed our push to the east. Scheisse! In a state of considerable apprehension, these groups fell on a motorized Soviet regiment, whose mass of vehicles seemed immobilized for all eternity. The night stillness was broken by the sound of our FMs and grenades, the cries of the Russians, surprised by this sudden and unexpected display of aggressiveness, and the roar of incendiary bombs, which must have consumed a costly quantity of materiel. Then our men made a half-turn, before the Russians were able to muster an organised reaction, and ran back to our trenches, bathed in transitory glory. We had, in fact, aroused the anger of the Russians, who decided to retaliate as soon as it was light. As at Belgorod, the whole horizon burst into flame, with the sudden total involvement of the opening bars of a Wagner opera. Our frantic dash to our positions assumed a tragic quality, as the rain of fire was so dense that a quarter of our men fell before they'd reached the line. Then we relived scenes and experiences very like what we'd known before. The sight of comrades screaming and writhing through final moments of agony had become no more bearable with familiarity, and I, despite my longing to live or die a worthy hero of the Wehrmacht, was no less an animal stiff with uncontrollable terror. Fortunately for us, the Luftwaffe, on which we could no longer rely, made an unexpected appearance and somewhat reduced the force of the Russian blow. But the next day this intervention was answered in kind, and Russian planes did what they could to knock out our artillery. As a result, our artillery was withdrawn during the night, leaving us to do the honours unsupported. We held our positions for 4 more terrible days, in spite of continuous infantry attacks supported by armour. Whenever possible, we buried our dead in the holes where they fell. 83 names were scratched off the company list. Among these, Olensheim, who had recovered from a serious wound at Belgorod, to receive his coup de grâce here on the west bank of the Dnieper, where tranquillity was to have been assured. The Russians had finally regrouped for their supreme effort and were delaying only to complete last-minute preparations. Their artillery, which seemed to be growing stronger by the hour, pounded our positions and the countryside for a long way back. The veteran had just been wounded and was waiting, along with some 100 other men, for evacuation to a hospital, or at least to a quieter zone in the rear. A brusque sergeant had taken Wiener's place, and I continued to feed ammunition into the Spandau, operated by someone considerably less expert than my friend. The night that followed was so horrible that I retain only a confused and fragmented memory of it. Fresh supplies of ammunition were often slung into a length of canvas and carried across the trenches by 2 or 4 fellows. The night of which I speak was, of course, total by 5 in the evening. Time in Russia is like that. In the summer there is almost no night, and in the winter no day. We had just withstood 2 or 3 major assaults. From the screams of anguish to our left, we concluded that a great many of our men had been killed. We had emptied 5 magazines and were warming our fingers on the hot metal of the machine gun. Our 6th and last magazine had been attached, and we were anxiously waiting for fresh supplies. The night was continuously lit by the explosions of thousands of Russian shells, which made movement extremely difficult. Our trenches, which in any case were not deep enough, extended only to certain positions. The others had to be reached by leaps and bounds, alternating with plunges to the ground, and writhing on our stomachs across dozens of yards of snow mixed with chunks of frozen earth. From time to time we could see 4 figures moving toward us, jumping from crater to crater, carrying shells for our 50mm mortar and magazines for the Spandau. They were still about 40 yards away when their shadowy mass was surrounded by a flash of white light. We never heard any cries. A few minutes later, I was sent out to crawl to the point of impact. The sergeant ordered me to bring back at least 2 magazines. I had just arrived at my destination when I heard the Russian assault cry, followed by a shower of grenades and mortar shells. The ground shook beneath me in a manner which defied all prediction. I felt like a pea inside a ferociously beaten drum. I was lying flat on the ground among the bodies of comrades killed only a few minutes before, unable to see any of the supplies I'd been sent to fetch. Then I heard the sound of a tank. The darkness all around me was broken by streaks of light and large pink and yellow explosions. In a momentary beam from some headlight, I could see a small sign marked S, 157. I opened my mouth wide, as prescribed, because I could hardly breathe, and lay where I was, frantically groping for something to hang on to in that diabolical setting, where horizontal and vertical alternated to the rhythm of the lights which slashed the darkness. I thought that I could recognize through the uproar the crackle of the weapon I had operated with Weena and had left only a moment before, and felt that my sanity might be close to collapse. I could see no escape from my situation, and lay glued to the ground with my head down, like a trussed animal waiting for the butcher's axe. 100 yards to my left, the pack, with its barrel marked for 11 kills, was fleeing into the striped darkness with its ammunition and gun crew. I heard the terrifying roar of a tank rising above the general tumult, and a headlight wavered and leapt through the undulating darkness. It had obviously driven through our defences and was now passing within 20 yards of where I lay. I saw it suddenly burst into flame, and despite the intense cold, a wave of hot air almost asphyxiated me. Half unconscious, I could hear the trample of running feet all around me, and, despite the noise of guns and explosions, cries which sounded more like curses than anything else, and were certainly neither French nor German. I thought I could distinguish 3 or 4 pairs of boots thumping past me. Everything happened so quickly at that moment that I am no longer sure of what I did see. I could still hear the sound of a machine gun, and then there were hundreds of shouting voices. The tank exploded a second time, showering steel fragments all around me. Some of our soldiers must still have been firing. Then there was a period of relative calm, which lasted for about 3/4 of an hour. Exhausted by nervous tension, I managed to pull myself out of my torpor enough to take a few steps toward the position I had left 20 minutes earlier, but nothing remained of it except smoke and motionless bodies. Furthermore, the entire sector, as far as I could see, was veiled in smoke. I turned back again, heading for our rear lines, and, too late to stop myself, tripped over a corpse. I realized that I had no weapon and grabbed the dead man's gun, which was lying beside him. Then I began to run. I heard 4 or 5 shots. The whistling flight of the bulls made me think of hell. I knew that I might faint at any moment, and between 2 spasms of nausea, fell into a hole where 3 fellows in roughly the same state as myself were staring fixedly at the dark, sombre east. Literally crumpled into the bottom of the hole, I attempted to order my thoughts. My retina still bore the imprint of 1,000 darting, luminous points, which prolonged my sense of vertigo. For a long moment I stayed where I was, wondering where to head next. Then I heard the other fellows in the hole exclaiming with astonishment. Far to the south, the earth seemed to have caught on fire, and the sky rang with the sound of thunder. 20 miles to the south, the second Dnieper front had given way in the face of irresistible Russian pressure, and thousands of German and Romanian soldiers met an apocalyptic end. Some 20 regiments had been unable to disengage in time and had laid down their arms to be rewarded for their bravery by captivity and degradation. For the rest of us, the war continued. In a rush, I decided to leave the hole which had received me a few moments before. Doubled over, I ran like a madman to another defensive position, where a group of soldiers were clustered around a motionless figure who was being bandaged. A fellow I didn't recognize hailed me by name. "Where have you come from, Sager?" My head was still pounding to the rhythm of the bombardment. I stared at him. "I don't know. I don't know any more. Everyone back there is dead. I ran away, through all the Russians." Behind us, we could hear the roar of an engine. A tractor was pulling a heavy anti-tank gun into position. Then we heard the burst of the exhaust a moment before each shell exploded. Our overwhelming weariness was now affecting us like a drug. Russian shells were coming over in profusion. For a moment we watched the storm closing in. Then, with a cry of despair and a prayer for mercy, we dived to the bottom of our hole, trembling as the earth shook, and the intensity of our fear grew. The shocks, whose centre seemed closer each time, were of an extraordinary violence. Torrents of snow and frozen earth poured down on us. A white flash, accompanied by an extraordinary displacement of air and an intensity of noise which deafened us, lifted the edge of the trench. None of us immediately grasped what had happened. We were thrown in a heap against the far wall of the hole, wounded and intact together. Then, with a roar, the earth poured in and covered us. In that moment, so close to death, I was seized by a rush of terror so powerful that I felt my mind was cracking. Trapped by the weight of earth, I began to howl like a madman. The memory of that moment terrifies me still. The sense that one has been buried alive is horrible beyond the powers of ordinary language. Dirt had run down my neck and into my mouth and eyes, and my whole body was gripped by a heavy and astonishingly inert substance, which only held me more tightly the harder I struggled. Under my thigh, I felt a leg kicking with the desperation of a horse between the shafts of a heavy cart. Something else was rubbing against my shoulder. With a sudden jerk, I pulled my head free of the dirt and of my helmet, whose strap was cutting into my windpipe, nearly strangling me. Some 2 feet from my face, a horrible mask pouring blood was howling like a demon. My body was still entirely trapped. I knew that I was either going to die or lose my reason. My throat burst with screams of rage and despair. No nightmare could possibly reach such a pitch of horror. At that moment I suddenly understood the meaning of all the cries and shrieks I had heard on every battlefield. And I also understood the marching songs, which so often begin with a ringing description of a soldier dying in glory, and then suddenly turn sombre. We marched together like brothers, and now he lies in the dust. My heart is torn with despair. My heart is torn with despair. Once again I learned how hard it is to watch a comrade die, almost as hard as dying oneself. During the night, the Russians made 9 attempts to break through our lines and failed. If they had persevered once, or maybe twice more, they would surely have been successful. I watched, 3/4 buried, for about 20 minutes while a hurricane of fire broke over our rear, destroying what was left of the village and killing something like 700 men in our regiment alone, which, at the beginning of the offensive, had numbered about 2,800 men. I scratched at the ground with my hands and somehow managed to free myself. 2 men were lying beside me in pools of blood. The dying man had been buried under more than a yard of earth and could no longer hope for anything but the mercy of heaven. A fellow beside me, who had been wounded, was groaning with pain. He was buried almost as deeply as I had been. I dug him out as fast as I could and helped him to crawl through the explosions toward the rear. On the way, I saw a gun lying on the ground and picked it up. The rest of the night was consumed by a series of almost insuperably difficult problems, as if we were caught in a terrible game with all the odds against us and our lives at stake. At dawn, in the first faint light of a dark winter day, the front grew quiet. The scattered remnants of our regiments collected as they met among the craters and shell holes. A cloud of stale smoke hung over the snowy ground, which was littered with Russian and German dead. The wounded who had not yet succumbed to the bitter cold were still groaning, filling the air with a chorus of misery which our exhausted ears heard as they might have heard a winter wind howling over the roof of an izba in an isolated hamlet on the steppe. Sections were organized to help the stretcher-bearers with a job of impossible magnitude. As always, the Russians left all rescue efforts to us. Their wounded were left lying where they fell, with a possibility of either dying on the spot or being picked up by one of our first aid teams. Their supplies of materiel seemed to be increasing daily in quantity and quality, but their medical services barely functioned. As our army grew more and more disorganized by retreat, we became increasingly unable to care for the thousands of wounded soldiers whose number was continuously growing. The Russian wounded could hope for very little from us. While the medical service tried to deal with the wounded, some 12 of us settled into a half-covered bunker back of our former sleeping quarters, which had been entirely destroyed. Herr Hauptmann Vesreidau, who had just arrived, was one of the group. Despite a general sense of foreboding in the face of disaster, we all felt a surge of joy whenever a particular friend appeared. Hals, Lenson and Lindbergh were all there. I was helping a wounded corporal bandage his severely burned right hand when the captain announced that we would retreat. He sent us out to help the non-coms count off and regroup our decimated company before moving camp at dawn. I went with Lenson to help him find what was left of his section. The Russians, who had also taken a beating, were catching a moment's rest before demolishing what remained of our front. For the moment, everything was quiet in the eerie half-light of December. Lenson couldn't quite grasp what had happened to me. For him, the simple fact that I had survived the Soviet thrust was extraordinary. My explanations that at the time I had understood nothing made no difference to him. He simply supplied his own scenario. My winter over. My winter overalls had entirely disappeared, leaving me with nothing but my singed overcoat. During my flight, I had picked up a gun, which proved to be Russian. For Lenson, it was all clear. The Russians had overrun my position and had either failed to notice me or had taken me for dead. In a desperate man-to-man struggle, I had managed to wrest a weapon from one of them and, with his gun, had fought my way to our lines. "You're still stunned," he insisted, "but I'm sure you'll remember later. I don't see any other explanation." Lenson's version certainly had its advantages. I myself retained nothing but a chaotic impression of flashing lights and thunderous noises over a sense of such total disorientation that I had no longer been capable of distinguishing east from west or up from down. Perhaps Lenson was only trying to compensate for his attitude during our evening of celebration. At dusk, which fell in the middle of the afternoon, the German army abandoned the second Dnieper front, while the immense Russian thrust, whose fringe had swept over us, was pressing with its principal strength against German and Romanian units further to the south. Our depleted columns withdrew from their positions, abandoning all materiel which was no longer usable or transportable. Our Grossdeutschland regiments, half of us on foot, left in relative silence, our backs bent by the weight of our burdens, hoping that the grey skies would hold back for a while longer the rain of metal and fire which the pursuing enemy was bound to send after us. Our prayers were granted, and we were able to march for 30 miles undisturbed. We were unpleasantly surprised to find no reserve positions within that distance. Except for a few surveillance posts, where the fellows, to their astonishment, were told to pack up and leave with us, we encountered no serious defensive efforts. The Russians could easily have continued their advance without firing a shot. On the second day of this third retreat, the most mobile portion of our battalion stopped and settled in to act as a covering force, while the rest continued westward. Some 2,000 men, among them myself, were stationed near a village which was not marked on any of the staff maps. As we arrived, the inhabitants fled into the thick forest. We established ourselves with light but motorized weapons. We had 4 minuscule tanks, which had been effective in Poland, but were like toys compared to the T-34S. Their armament consisted of a double-barreled machine gun and a grenade thrower, and we used them principally as tractors to pull the 12 sleighs which made up our train. 4 half-tracks doubled as anti-tank machine gun posts and as a source of emergency power for our 6 trucks when they stuck in the deep snowdrifts. 3 enormous Zundap-Russland sidecars skated through the powdery snow, which often plugged the space between the front mudguard and tyre, preventing that wheel from turning. Their engines were powerful enough to free the back wheel and the wheel of the sidecar, which was also motorized, and send the whole machine zigzagging forward, roaring from its twin exhausts, while the blocked driving wheel skated over the surface like the runner of a sleigh. 3 packs completed our defence. With these weapons, suitable for chasing partisans, and the classic infantry weapons, PMs, mortars, FMs and grenades, we had been ordered to stop 3 Russian divisions, including several armoured regiments, for at least 24 hours. Lastly, our orders were to withdraw, even if our efforts were triumphantly successful. Throughout our sector, whose front was roughly 60 miles long, groups analogous to ours were left behind, while the main body of troops withdrew to the west in a series of forced marches. The Russians, who had broken through further south, neglected our sector. There was no need for them to take any more losses pursuing an enemy who was withdrawing anyway. The Red Army left our harassment to the partisans, whose numbers were continuously increasing and soon reached astonishing proportions in a country nominally under our control. On Stalin's orders, they intensified the desperation of our retreat with sudden ambushes, shells with delayed action fuses, booby-trapped and mutilated bodies of men from interior positions, attacks on supply trains, isolated groups and rallying points, hideous mutilation of prisoners, and a constant refusal of contact with units capable of fighting. The partisans, or terrorists, a name they richly deserved, always took on easy victims and greatly intensified the usual cruelties of wartime. By these means they achieved an effect that the regular army was never able to equal. The Wehrmacht bent before the power of an incomparably greater enemy. The unbearable harassment by partisans was added to the overwhelming and heroic rigours of the front, while our territories in the rear no longer guaranteed any repose to our exhausted troops. The Ukraine, which had shown some sympathy for us, was itself pillaged by partisan bands, on orders from Moscow. The Ukrainian population had to choose and be actively for one side or another. The partisans either killed or enlisted the young Ukrainians who had until then been so respectful to us. The invisible war triumphed, a war which no longer offered any retreat, calm, or pity. Wars of subversion have no face and, like revolutions, create their own martyrs, innocent victims and hostages, provoking confused judgments of ill-considered actions. Men kill for revenge, in reprisal for what has happened or might happen. The partisans were pouring oil onto a huge conflagration. In the name of Marxist liberty, the Ukraine was forced to alter its attitude. Germans and Ukrainians alike grew bitter and full of hate. The war became a total war, a war of scorched earth, offering the towns and villages in its path no more relief than we would eventually receive when we became the vanquished. In this period, as the war attained the most violent paroxysms of an already unbearable conflict, our unit sat out its sentence of round-the-clock guard duty in the murderous cold. Over the snow-covered ground, silence hung, unbroken except for the occasional howl of a grey tiger wolf deep in the forests, which were still largely unexplored. A quarter of our men were always on guard, watching from the shelter of ludicrously inadequate fortifications, or frost-covered tank turrets, or mounting hurried patrols at the edge of the forest. The rest waited in the abandoned izbas. The stoves in these huts had been systematically destroyed before we arrived, no doubt by partisans, who hoped that without shelter we would die of cold. Some of the izbas were open to the sky, with their roofs burned or pulled off. Probably the partisans had not had time to destroy the village completely before we arrived. There were far too many of us for the number of buildings still standing, and hundreds of men were reduced to finding what shelter they could, huddled behind gutted walls whose only roof was the heavy, opaque fog. Inside the walls, these men burned everything they could find. In the better izbas, the intense flames threatened to set fire to the structures themselves. Our exhausted troops no longer bothered to collect deadwood from the forest and burned every combustible fitting left in the huts. Cursing at the smoke which blinded them, and which in the roofed izbas escaped only through the open doors, our soldiers packed closely together for warmth, trying to sleep on their feet despite the coughs which shook their bodies. In the izbas without roofs, smoke was never a difficulty, but the men were never warm. Those closest to the fires rapidly grew so hot they had to move, while others, only 4 or 5 yards away, felt only the faintest warming of the air, which rose to 15 or 16 degrees above zero. Every 2 hours, another quarter of the men went back to the dugouts to make room in our precarious sleeping quarters for those who would return white with cold. The winter was now serious, 15 degrees below zero, according to the thermometer of our radio group. As before, our general state of filth aggravated the situation. Any desire to piss was announced to all present, so that hands swollen by chilblains could be held out under the warm urine, which often infected our cracked fingers. I was taking my first tour of guard duty in the early morning hours of polar darkness, and my second began at 1 o'clock, in the diffused light of midday, which was veiled by a sky as dark as the sky over Tempelhof the day it was destroyed. Toward the end of my patrol, the day would turn an unusual pink. By 3 o'clock, when I returned to the smokehouse, there was nothing further to report. My eyes hurt me, and my nose was so inflamed by frostbite I could no longer bear to leave it uncovered. We hid our faces like Chicago gangsters, with our collars raised and tied around our faces with scarves or strings. An hour later, the pink light turned violet and then grey. The snow turned grey too, and then it was dark, from mid-afternoon until 9 the next morning. With darkness, the temperature always plunged sharply, often to 35 or 40 degrees below zero. Our materiel was paralyzed, gasoline froze, and oil became first a paste and then a glue, which entirely blocked the mechanism. The forest rang with strange sounds, the bark of trees bursting under the pressure of the freezing. Stones cracked only when the temperature fell to 60 degrees below zero. For us, the horror we had been dreading for so long had arrived. Winter at war, a reality we had almost forgotten, fell on us like the die of a gigantic press ready to crush us. Everything combustible was burned. A lieutenant defended 2 of our sleighs with a gun against some 40 lancer, whose breath rattled through their congested lungs. The nose of every face cover developed a block of ice which grew larger as each fresh breath condensed and froze. "We want the sleighs for wood!" the men shouted. "Get back!" the lieutenant screamed in reply. "The forest is full of wood!" The lancer stared at him, wondering what good the sleighs would do them if they all froze. A party sent out to fetch wood from the forest ran to the shelter of the trees. Faceless spectres returned with bundles which they threw down onto the dying fires. The fires had to be kept alive, which made rest impossible. We prayed that the Russians wouldn't attack. All attempts at defence had been abandoned. Guard duty was the hardest of all. To stand still, one seriously risked being frozen alive. At 9 o'clock it was my turn again. 15 of us were standing watch in the ruins of a building crusted with hard snow, which cracked like glass. We got through the first half hour beating each other to keep our blood moving. The second half hour was torture. 2 men fainted. We thrust our stiffened hands from our sleeves and clumsily tried to help them. Our gloves, part wool and part leather, were already full of holes and good for nothing. The pain in our hands and feet seemed to travel through our bodies and clutch at our hearts. 4 men carried the unconscious soldiers to the fires which gleamed in the darkness. If the Russians had come, they could easily have wiped us out. 1 man was running round and round in small circles, crying like a baby. The pain in my feet made me scream aloud. Despite orders, I abandoned my post and ran to the nearest izba. Shoving my way through a compact mass of soldiers, I stopped just short of the fire and fell grimacing to my knees. Then I thrust my boots right into the coals. They immediately began to crackle and hiss, and at the pain of contact between hot and cold I burst into loud sobs. I was not the only one to cry, and there were others whose screams and moans were far louder than mine. The hour of release finally came, and we prepared to leave. The Russians had not swarmed down on us, and the steel of our frosted weapons, which had not been heated by explosions, glimmered bluer than ever in the horrible cold and looked as brittle as glass. Our men assembled listlessly, torn by a conflict of disloyalties which brought them close to madness. Although no one had covered himself with glory fighting against the Russians, another fight, which was equally formidable, had been fought against the cold and our exhaustion and filth, and the lice we scarcely felt. They had become so much a part of our everyday condition. The cold had also claimed its victims. 3 times detachments of the last group on guard had returned to the fires carrying inert bodies. Pneumonia, generalized frostbite, and physical weakness had been unable to resist the overwhelming cold. For 3 men, their return to the fire came too late. 5 others were revived by flagellation and alcohol. In the motionless cold of the polar night, we covered the rigid corpses with snow, marking each improvised grave with a stick and a helmet. There was no time for sentiment or reflection. Those who were still, to their astonishment, among the living, were trying to shake off the general numbness enough to start our solidly frozen engines. The situation seemed desperate. Not one of the engines turned over. Feldwebel Spurlowski stamped down on the pedals of his Zundap, which resisted the pressure his 190 pounds of flesh and bone could still bring to bear, and then cracked like a piece of dead wood. The metal itself seemed to be affected. We lit fires under the panzers to try to thaw them slowly before making any attempt to start them. For the cursing, gasping lancer, the effort was immense, straining our congested lungs, which whistled and rattled. Wesredo himself was impatient. He had wrapped his boots in rags picked up during the retreat. "We should have kept at least one engine running all night," he exclaimed. "It's elementary. This sort of carelessness could ruin all of us." We listened to him with expressionless faces. Undoubtedly, several among us would have regarded death as a deliverance. An hour or so later, we heard the asthmatic backfire of an engine. Someone had managed to start one of the half-tracks. The driver let it warm up for a while and set to work on the gearbox, which had not yet thawed. After 2 hours of intense effort, our column set out, under orders to maintain the lowest possible speed. Until the machines had reached a certain minimum temperature, we had to limp after them on foot. At midday, there were several breakdowns, and the convoy had to stop. The radiator hoses of several vehicles had been damaged by the pure alcohol in the radiators, and we had to repair them, using spare parts if we were fortunate enough to have them. Otherwise, we patched them up as best we could. While the work was in progress, we opened some cans of solidly frozen food, meat which could be chopped with an axe, a puree of peas and soya with the consistency of cement, and a solid brick of wine. Our enforced stop cost us an hour. According to radio instructions, we had 1 more hour to rejoin the main body of troops. We were crossing the territory of one of our interior defence posts, 2 round blockhouses and 3 or 4 huts built into the ground. No one came out to meet us, and the place seemed deserted. However, a plume of smoke was rising from one of the blockhouses. No doubt the men inside were asleep beside a warm fire. We sent a small group over to investigate. 5 minutes later, one of them ran back to the column, his breath spreading around his face in white clouds. When he reached us, he stopped, gasping. "Everything in there has been destroyed, Herr Hauptmann, and everyone is dead. It's terrible." Every grey face filled with anxiety. Looking more closely, we saw that the doors of the Isbas had all been knocked in, and that 4 or 5 bodies lay beside one of the huts. "Partisans!" someone shouted. 6 men recently killed! "There's been fighting here recently, Herr Hauptmann. Those bandits must still be holding their guns." Another detachment went into the second blockhouse. There was a long, echoing explosion, and a geyser of earth and snow and fragments of wood shot into the air over the building. Wesredo cursed aloud and ran towards the smoking bunker. We followed him. 3 men had just been torn to pieces. 2 were unrecognizable, while the third was gasping his last breath, rattling as the blood spurted from his body. Mixed into the rubble lay the bodies of 4 German soldiers who had been killed before we arrived. "Watch out for mines!" Wesredo shouted. The word passed from mouth to mouth. Soldiers stopped at the door of the second blockhouse and looked in without daring to enter. 6 men, who had been stripped almost naked and hideously mutilated, were lying in pools of black, congealed blood. Some of the mutilations were so horrible that we couldn't look at them. 2 soldiers, men who had fought outside of Moscow, at Kursk, Bryansk and Belgorod, and seen appalling horrors, hid their faces in their hands and walked away. None of us had ever seen anything so gratuitously horrible. Taking infinite precautions, a section removed the cadavers. 2 of them had been booby-trapped. We covered their bodies with debris, as we had neither the means nor the time to dig graves. To all of us, the tactics of the partisans seemed more ignoble and senseless than anything else we'd seen. Wesredo led a ceremony of final farewell to the 18 massacred men. We removed our hats, caps and helmets and stood bareheaded in the snow. Ich hatte einen Kameraden. Our funeral song rang through the Stone Age setting of Russian winter with the discordant sonorities of thousands of voices. There were no flags or fanfares, only profound consternation. The spirit of revenge motivating the terrorists further destroyed the fragments of understanding so far spared by the war. Our men could not accept it. If they could still bear the torment of the trenches with heroic resolution, they could not accept the treachery of the partisans. Our column set out again. As we passed the centre blockhouse, we saw the coarse placard thrust into the snowy mound. Across it, scrawled in charcoal, we read the word "Revenge." We drove on for another hour. The snow, which deadened the noise of our vehicles, also intensified distant sounds. Suddenly we heard the crackle of automatic weapons. Wesrado, together with our 2 other officers, ordered us to halt. Immediately we heard the noise of firing more distinctly. Some 5 miles to the west, fighting was in progress. We were ordered forward on the double. The tank crews wanted to go on ahead and rush to the scene of combat, but our officers couldn't allow them to leave the column. We had to stay together, with our tank tractors each pulling 3 Russian sleighs loaded with men and equipment. The half-tracks helped the trucks, which would never have been able to make it alone. I was riding on the 3rd sleigh of one of these trains. Behind us was a large sidecar whose transmission was failing. The tanks were pulling with full power, to the great peril of their own mechanisms. The crackle of guns grew continuously louder. Suddenly, Wesrado stopped the convoy and jumped down to check his maps. Everyone on the sleighs was ordered to follow him, and I found myself going into action once again. The panzers detached themselves from their trains and drove toward the noise. We followed, running as fast as we could, waved forward by Wesrado, who came with us in a large BMW sidecar. A Steiner with an 80mm mortar skidded past us in a cloud of whirling snow. Gasping for breath, we ran along the track made by the tanks. They had pulled far ahead of us and entered into combat with the enemy some 10 minutes before we reached the scene of fighting. We could hear their machine guns ripping into the air, sounding much louder than usual. The sidecar came back toward us and suddenly spun round. "Spread out into the forest!" We carried out the order, some of us remaining behind to pull out the sidecar, which was stuck in a drift, before running on through the trees, standing up as straight as the masts of ships. The virgin snow rasped and cracked in great sheets under our weight. We could no longer see the tanks, which seemed to be pursuing an enemy in flight. We didn't meet any partisans ourselves. 20 minutes later, a flare called us to the nearby blockhouse, which was like every other. It was supposed to guard the track, which in normal times was heavily used. The post had been attacked by partisans, which of course we had to expect, probably the same band that had massacred the men we'd found earlier. Here, fortunately, there had been time for the defence to react. Of the 22 men holding the post, 6 had been wounded and 2 killed. Some 20 enemy dead or wounded lay on the trampled snow. There were also several guns, Russian and German, and some American. A few wounded partisans were trying to crawl into the forest. No order could have stopped our men. They fired at the Russians and put an end to their suffering. 2 shaggy prisoners had fallen into our hands. Their eyes rolled wildly like the eyes of trapped wolves, and they answered our questions with absurd, repetitive replies. We, not communists. What did they take us for? Or did they really know nothing? That, of course, was possible. They looked like beasts being dragged to slaughter. No talk was possible, and our men were muttering for revenge. Wesrado looked at the partisans and then at us. He tried a little longer to get something from the prisoners, but his efforts were unavailing. Finally, his patience exhausted, he raised his arm with feigned indifference. Our men grabbed the 2 prisoners and pushed them along in front of them. The human wolves looked back, snarling, but the sight of our guns made them lose their heads. They began to run, and ran until the first volley caught them and knocked them to the ground. The post had been saved at the last possible moment. According to the men who'd been there, at least 400 partisans had attacked them, and the fighting had lasted for over 2 hours. The men greeted us with bear hugs. They were overjoyed to hear that we had brought an evacuation order with us. For the moment, we seemed to be acting as the last broom of the Wehrmacht, making a clean sweep. To crown the misery of the day, a hideous incident occurred within 10 minutes of our departure from that place. The sidecar at the head of the column, preceding the first tank by some 30 to 40 yards, drove back onto the track, moving through the snow with considerable difficulty. A tank followed it, rolling over the same ground. Suddenly an explosion shook the earth and reverberated through the air. Frozen snow showered down with a crystalline sound from the heavily laden branches all around us. The tank had been blown off its tracks and torn open from below. We could hear the roar of the flames as fat plumes of smoke rolled out from beneath the machine, spreading over the icy ground. The men on the sleighs which followed reacted immediately. One of the junior officers jumped onto the turret of the tank to try to free the frantic men inside, who were probably seriously wounded. Others ran to help, while the infantry spread out on either side of the road to be ready for any eventuality. By now the tank was wrapped in thick black smoke, and we could do nothing to help the trapped men. We emptied 3 extinguishers onto the blackened metal, but the flames inside only increased in violence. The sleighs were hastily drawn back as the tank's reservoir poured out 40 gallons of flaming gasoline, which spread across the snow. In panic, the scorched Lancer yielded to the fire whose black plumes of smoke were climbing into the dark sky. In helpless anger, officers and men alike watched the immolation of 3 men. The smell of burned flesh mingled ignominiously with the smell of gas and oil. The 2 men in the lead sidecar had passed over the same spot a few seconds before the tank. Their tires must have missed the detonator of the partisans' mine by only an inch or 2. They also watched the hideous scene with cold sweat running down their spines. The column abandoned the burning tank, whose flames had begun to make its ammunition explode. We also abandoned 3 heavy sleighs and some of our material, which we burned. The men who had ridden on those sleighs found places on other vehicles. We all made a wide detour to avoid the exploding machine gun bullets. We left behind the tomb of 2 men who had been killed without a chance to defend themselves, 2 men who had 3 years of fighting behind them and who deserved Valhalla. We abandoned the territory to the red waves that followed us. This was the final passage of the last European crusade, in the complete sense of the word. The piercing cold was a continuous element we could never forget, even during moments of strong emotion, as in our recent clash with the partisans. A short time later, we rejoined the division in a town of a certain size and importance called Boporoivska, if I remember correctly. Between the trenches and the barbed wire, the engineers and the TOT organization were busy mining the area. Other infantry regiments and an armoured unit equipped with Tiger Panzers had also reached this point. A dozen of these motionless monsters seemed to be grinning at us as they watched the passage of our battered equipment. The presence of the Tigers reassured everyone. They were like steel fortresses, and no Russian tank could equal them. Several Wehrmacht civil servants had been billeted at Boporoivska. These gentlemen were surprised and displeased to find themselves suddenly at the centre of a battlefield. They all seemed to be in an extremely bad humour, and their attitude toward us seemed tinged with a certain distrust. Perhaps their bureaucratic minds resented our fighting as we retreated. For them, Russia meant this organised town where one could shelter from the cold and eat one's fill, provided one had established the proper connections with supply. Perhaps there were also charming evenings with the charming Ukrainian women who seemed to abound in these parts. These ladies and girls seemed to be preparing for a hasty departure in the company of their gentlemen friends to look for a distant and more tranquil spot. We, it seemed, would be given the honour of defending these bureaucratic love nests. This attitude infuriated us, and many brawls began, but were quickly stifled. In the end, we were too exhausted and hungry to bother with these people, and occupied the warm izbus we were given with the greatest satisfaction. In the izbus we found food and drink and the opportunity to wash. Our cabins were rarely equipped with candles or lamps, but the flames in the fireplaces, which we fed with every combustible substance we could find, brilliantly lit these fragments of paradise. Within a few hours of our arrival, several cubic yards of snow had been melted in each billet, and we were all stripped naked, scrubbing off our filth as best we could. We soaked our trousers, underwear, shirts and tunics with feverish, almost panicky haste. Our opportunity would certainly be brief, and everyone wished to make the most of it. Someone had even found a box full of small cakes of toilet soap. These were mixed into the water of the largest tubs. In turn, timed by a stopwatch, we plunged into the warm, foaming bath, 2 minutes each and no overtime. We joked and larked as we hadn't done for months. The water spilled over the edge of the tub and flooded the big room, where some 30 shadowy figures cavorted. We kept pouring water into the tubs to keep the level up. The dim light prevented us from noticing that the foam, which so delighted us, had turned grey with filth. However, our lice died a scented death. Marie rose. When we had finished washing, we emptied the tubs into a hole we had dug inside the isba. There was no question of going outside. The thermometer registered 20 degrees below zero, and everyone was naked. When the water was gone, we broke up the tubs and burned them. The fire had a voracious appetite, which was difficult to satisfy. Howells was exultantly chewing a fragment of soap, laughing and shouting that he had to clean his innards too, as they were probably just as filthy and overrun with lice as his skin. "Now the Popovs can come whenever they like," he shouted. "I feel like a new man." The door suddenly opened, letting in a blast of astonishing cold. Everyone howled in protest. 2 soldiers stood on the threshold, their arms loaded with delicacies for the table. We gaped at this gift from heaven as the soldiers laid down their burden on a pile of damp overcoats. A string of spicy wurst, several loaves of gingerbread, several boxes of Norwegian sardines, a brick of smoked bacon. There were also 8 or 10 bottles, schnapps, cognac, Rhine wine, and cigars. The fellows kept right on emptying the huge pockets of their coats, and our shouts of astounded delight seemed to shake the flimsy walls. "Whoa! Where did you find it?" someone asked, almost sobbing with joy. "Those goddamn bureaucrats were really living it up. Gransk, our company cook, never saw anything like this. Those bastards were keeping it all here. They were ready to run off with it too. This is just a small sample, but they're all as mad as hornets. Said they'd report us for stealing personal possessions. Who the hell do they think they're fooling? They can take their goddamn report, and any time they like, I'll tell them what they can do with it. To hell with them!" Everyone plunged into that astonishing mound of delicacies. Halsey's eyes were starting out of his head. "Keep my share for a minute," he said, pulling on his damp clothes. "I've got to have a look for myself and bring back some more. Those bastards think they're going to leave us to take care of the front while they clear out with all this delicatessen, for God's sake." Howells wrapped himself in a Soviet eiderdown and rushed out into the cold. Solma, a young fellow who was half Hungarian and had joined the regiment under more or less the same circumstances as I had, went with him. When they had gone, Pastor Ferrum, aided by Obergefreiter Lenzen, and Hoth, Lenson's number 2 man at the Panzerfaust, divided up the food. We had to hack the bacon with our picks because our bayonets were too blunt. Ferrum, who must have left some of his religious convictions on the east bank of the Dnieper along with his virginity, was swearing like a pagan. To think that this damned thing, which has already poked holes in plenty of guts, should be stopped by a goddamned piece of bacon. Borrow some dynamite from the tot if you have to, but hurry up with it. No one was cheated. The amazing sense of comradeship and unity of the Wehrmacht held, and everyone received a fair share. The war had brought together men from many different regions and walks of life, who would probably have mistrusted each other under any other circumstances. But the circumstances of war united us in a symphony of heroism, in which each man felt himself to a certain extent responsible for all of his fellows. The bureaucratic attitude, preserved in this relatively peaceful atmosphere, astonished rather than shocked us. We felt that it was perfectly legitimate to plunder these stockpiles of hoarded goods. The sense of order that was part of National Socialism was still very much alive among the troops fighting for it. Those who appropriated delicacies for themselves while combat troops were dying of hunger seemed to belong to another species. Ferrum spoke of all this as he ate, comparing these officials to the bourgeoisie Hitler speaks of in Mein Kampf. Combat troops have immediate concerns. For men living the lives of hunted beasts, all leisurely conversation is a waste of time. We had to eat and drink what and when we could, and make love when we could, without taking any time for eloquence over the girl's hair or eyes. Every moment was precious. Every hour might be our last. Halse's and Solma's shares waited for them inside their helmets, which were turned upside down. We sang as we emptied the bottles. Our friends who'd gone out for more didn't come back, and later Hals cursed that impulse. He and Solma had been caught pinching some cognac from one of the bureaucrats, which meant 6 days of detention for both of them. Christmas night, 1943. The wind howled through the labyrinth of trenches north of Boporoivska. 2 companies occupied the positions prepared by the Security Division and the TOT organization, which had since withdrawn to the west beyond the Bessarabian frontier. We had settled into these ice-coated molehills 2 days earlier. The front seemed solid, and we would almost certainly be fighting soon. The collapse of our southern front had forced this last retreat and regrouping along this line. The vast Soviet thrust was moving inexorably and slowly toward us, like a steamroller. We were well aware of this, and the continuous build-up of reinforcements in our sector led us to foresee a violent clash. The country immediately around us was hilly and wooded. Tanks and mobile artillery waited in the frozen underbrush and terrible cold, which stripped the bark off the trees. The stocks of provisions in Boporoivska had been repeatedly plundered. Our commandant had tacitly consented to a few days of carousal, as if to compensate for the impending Holocaust. It was Christmas night. Despite our miserable circumstances, we were filled with emotion, like children who have been deprived of joy for a long time. Under our steel helmets and behind our silent faces moved a crowd of glittering memories. Some men talked of peace, others of childhoods which were still very close, trying to hide their feelings and hopeless, ludicrous dreams by hardening their voices. Wezredo made his round of the trenches, talking to the men, but his words seemed only to disturb private reflections, and he soon withdrew into his own. He too undoubtedly had children and wished to be with them. Sometimes he stopped for a moment and looked up at the sky, which had cleared. The frost glittered on his long coat like spangles on a Christmas tree. For 4 days we had to endure nothing more severe than the cold. The sections in the line were relieved continually, and the unbearable nights were divided into 2 parts. Each day brought fresh cases of pneumonia. Frostbite had become commonplace. Twice I was carried into an izba and brought back to consciousness and life from the brink of death. Our faces were badly cracked, particularly at the corners of the lips. Fortunately, we had enough to eat. The cooks had been given special orders to prepare our food with as much fat as possible. Supplies arrived regularly, which enabled Gransk to produce gluey soups full of margarine. These concoctions were nauseating but effective. Our cooks had learned something about cold weather cooking from the ingredients of Russian soups. We also took saunas, a horse doctor treatment which didn't coddle any weaklings. We moved straight from the hot steam into cold showers, a transition so violent that our hearts often threatened to stop beating. Like Granska's greasy soups, however, these shocks were effective, and we always felt better afterward. "Make the most of it," Gransk told us. "Eat up and enjoy it. In Germany, kids are going without dessert, so you can have this." Alas, Granska's words were too accurate. As Paula explained in a letter which reached me in only 6 days, rationing had become very strict. We were getting much closer to our own frontier, and every day the distance from home seemed smaller. Soon Germany at bay would no longer be able to send us even margarine. One morning, the Feldwebel's whistles drove us from the overheated izba where we slept. A patrol of Soviet tanks was just over a mile from Boporoivska. The cold as we ran outside was like a blow from the butcher's axe. Each man galloped to a precise point. We had not yet reached our positions when the sound of heavy explosions shook the thin air to the west of us. Russian tanks, charging like maddened bulls, had driven onto our minefield. Now it was the turn of Russian tank crews to go up in smoke. Our observers were watching through their field glasses. Almost all the tanks were trying to withdraw the way they'd come. Our artillery remained silent, leaving the tanks to the mines. Firing might even set off these traps. However, 3 Stalin tanks had managed to cross the minefield and were driving toward the town in a roar of chains and exhaust. With extraordinary courage, they took the fire of our 37 anti-tank guns without slowing down, only to be hit by our camouflaged Tigers, with their terrible 88S. In a sequence as unreal as anything Hollywood could contrive, all 3 tanks were hit by the first salvo. One turned over and exploded. Another stopped dead like a boar hit behind the shoulder. The third, although hit, turned without stopping, exposing its flank to our anti-tank machine guns, which ripped off all its protruding guns. It continued in a circle broken by a series of banking turns, trying to execute a half-turn. This dramatic attempt left us gasping with admiration. In his will to survive, the Russian driver headed straight for our minefield. A series of explosions ripped the tracks off his left side, and the tank slowly settled like a vanquished beast. As the thick black smoke began to pour from its entrails, two dark figures climbed out. But our cold, stiffened fingers did not fire. Both Russians were holding their pistols, prepared to defend themselves. When they didn't hear any guns, they took a few steps toward our lines, then threw down their guns and raised their hands. A moment later, they were crossing our front line. The Lancer, who considered them heroes, grinned, and the Russians grinned back, their teeth gleaming very white like Negroes' teeth in their smoke-blackened faces. Our men took them to an izba and gave them some schnapps. Their attitude and performance seemed so far removed from those of the partisans that we felt no hate for them. Lenson watched them for a moment and said, "If Wiener were here, he'd probably drink a toast with them." During the following night, we sent out patrols to relay the minefield. Our defensive fighting was relying increasingly on mines to take the place of weakened or missing lines. The next day there was a general reinforcement of the front. 2 Romanian regiments and a Hungarian battalion were sent to join us. We were told that we would also have the support of a squadron of fighter bombers based somewhere near Vinnitsa. "It seems we're getting ready for a big show," Verham observed. "I don't like it." Obergefreiter Lenson took the opposite view, rejoicing in our increased strength. As he saw it, the red tide must be stopped here. The idea that Prussia itself would soon fall into enemy hands never even crossed his mind. But then, that was true of all of us. One night, the Russians sent a human wave of Mongols in a direct assault against our positions. Their function was to knock out the minefield by crossing it. As the Russians preferred to economize on tanks, and as their human stockpile was enormous, they usually sent out men for jobs of this kind. The Soviet attack failed, but Stalin hadn't been looking for success. The minefield exploded under the howling mob, and we sent out a curtain of yellow and white fire to obliterate anyone who had survived. The fragmented cadavers froze very quickly, sparing us the stench which would otherwise have polluted the air over a vast area. The Russians had not even used any of their artillery to help the Mongols, which seemed to confirm our estimate of the situation. We sent out patrols to try to remine the field, but the Russians were ready to fire on anything that moved. We were able to put down only a light sprinkling of mines, with regrettably heavy losses. It was clearly no longer possible to rely on mines to protect our front lines. On another evening, when the cold had attained a dramatic intensity, the Russians attacked again. We were manning our positions in a temperature which had dropped to 45 degrees below zero. Some men fainted as the cold struck them, paralyzed before they even had a chance to scream. Survival seemed almost impossible. Our hands and faces were coated with engine grease, and when our worn gloves were pulled over this gluey mixture, every gesture became extremely difficult. Our tanks, whose engines would no longer start, swept the spaces in front of them with their long tubes, like elephants caught in a trap. The moujiks preparing to attack us were suffering in the same way. Freezing where they stood before, there was time for even one Ura Pobieda. The men on both sides, suffering a common martyrdom, were longing to call it quits. Metal broke with astonishing ease. The Soviet tanks were advancing blindly through the pale light of flares, which intensified the bluish glitter of the scene. These tanks were destroyed by the mines which lay parallel to our trenches some 30 yards from our front lines, or by our Tigers, which fired without moving. The Russian troops, with frozen hands and feet, faltered and withdrew in confusion in the face of the fire we kept steady, despite our tortured hands. Their officers, who had hoped to find us paralyzed by cold and incapable of defense, were unconcerned about the condition of their own troops. They were ready to make any sacrifice, so long as our lines were attacked. I managed to keep my hands from freezing by thrusting them, in their gloves, into 2 empty ammunition boxes when the cartridges had run out in the Spandau. Our gunners, and everyone forced to use their hands, sooner or later turned up at the medical service with severe cases of freezing. There were a great many amputations. The intense cold lasted for 3 weeks, during which the Russians restricted themselves to sending over music calculated to make us homesick and speeches inviting us to surrender. Toward the end of January, the cold lessened somewhat and became tolerable. At times, during the day, the thermometer rose as high as 5 degrees above zero. The nights were still murderous, but with frequent shifts of duty we managed to get through them. We knew that the Russian offensive would soon resume. One night, or rather one morning, toward 4 or 5 o'clock, blasts of the whistle sent us out once again to our interception posts. A mass of T-34 and Sherman tanks were moving forward in a loud roar. An artillery bombardment had preceded them, inflicting heavy damage on Boporoivska and provoking a mass evacuation by the civilian population, which had been waiting for the fighting in terrified apprehension. Our tanks, about 15 Tigers, 10 Panthers, and a dozen Mark IV-S and -3S, had managed to start their engines, which had been heated continuously the day before. At the beginning of the offensive, 2 Mark IV-S had been destroyed side by side in the Russian bombardment. The front was once again threatening to give way. We lay in our trenches, our eyes reduced to slits, waiting for the hordes of Red infantry which would surely be coming soon. For the moment, our machine guns and Panzerfausts were quiet, leaving the way clear for our heavy artillery and our tanks. Adroitly camouflaged, the Tigers lay waiting, with their engines idling. Almost every time a Russian tank came into range, a sharp, strident burst set it on fire. The Russians were moving toward us slowly, sure of themselves, firing at random. Their tactic of demoralization would have worked if there had not been so many plumes of black smoke rising against the pale February sky. Our 37S and Panzerfausts, designed to be used at almost point-blank range, were scarcely called on. The first wave of Soviet armour was consumed 500 yards from our first positions, nailed down by the concentrated fire of our Tigers and Panthers and heavy anti-tank guns. The Tiger was an astonishing fortress. Enemy fire seemed to have almost no effect on its shell, which, at the front, was 5½ inches thick. Its only weakness was its relative immobility. A second Russian wave followed closely after the first, more dense than the first, and accompanied by a swarm of infantry which posed a serious threat. We waited, dry-mouthed, our guns jammed against our shoulders and our grenades in easy reach. Our hearts were pounding. Suddenly, like a miracle, 30 of our planes flew over. As promised, the squadron from Vinitsa was attacking. This particular job was easy for them, and every bomb hit home. A cry of "Sieg Heil der Luftwaffe" rang so loudly from our trenches that the pilots might almost have heard it. We opened fire with everything we had, but the Russian offensive kept coming despite overwhelming losses. Our tanks drove at the stricken enemy with an ardour worthy of 1941. The noise became unbearable. The air was thick with bitter fumes and smoke, and the smells of gunpowder and burned gasoline. Our shouts mingled with the shouts of the Russians, who were reeling under the unexpected resistance. We were able to watch the magnificent progress of our Tigers, pulverizing the enemy tanks before they were able to complete a half-turn. The Luftwaffe attacked again with rockets and 20mm cannons. The Russian rout was hidden by a thick curtain of luminous smoke. The Russian artillery kept on firing at our lines, causing several deaths which we scarcely noticed. However, their guns were soon overrun by their own retreating troops and fell silent. A second wave of German planes, an undreamed-of extra luxury, completed the Russian debacle. We hugged each other in excitement, bursting with joy. For a year now we had been retreating before an enemy whose numerical superiority was constantly increasing. Lenson was shouting like a man possessed by demons, "I told you we'd do it! I told you we'd do it!" Our achievement was mentioned in special bulletins. The front on the Romanian border had held. After months of sustained attack and terrible cold, German and Romanian troops had once again pushed back the Russian offensive and destroyed quantities of enemy materiel. The mass of broken, twisted metal strewn with corpses that lay in front of us was visible proof of what we'd done. Along a front of 200 miles, the Red Army had launched 16 attacks inside of a month. Taking into account the 3 weeks of inactivity during which all operations were impossible, these 16 attacks had all occurred inside the space of 1 week. 5 points had borne the brunt of the Russian effort, and at only one had the Russians come close to success. The front was broken to the south, but this thrust was cut off, and the Russian troops were either annihilated or taken prisoner. In our sector, all the lines had held, and we felt very proud. We had proved once again that with adequate materiel and a certain minimum preparation, we could hold off an enemy of greatly superior size, whose frenzied efforts were never intelligently employed. The veteran Wiener had often remarked on this Russian failing at difficult moments. At the sight of an enemy tank in flames, he would bare his teeth in a wide, wolfish grin. "What a damned fool," he would say, "to let himself get caught like that. It's only their numbers that will get us some day." There were 30 Iron Crosses for the Gross Deutschland, and as many for the small tank regiment, which also earned the honour. The division had been routed several times and had sustained serious losses. Units believed to be intact were often borrowed from us and sent to bolster some faltering position. When they arrived, they would be found short by about 2/3 of their strength. There was nothing to be done about it. Our own group was enjoying a much-needed spell of relative calm. Our existence would have been almost idyllic, except for the depressing and infuriating quality of barracks life. The exercises we were given, as if we were green troops in for basic training, brought us close to open revolt. We had moved 250 miles to a position in Poland, far from the front. Our camp was on the banks of the Dniester, some 50 miles from Lvov, in the foothills of the Carpathians. The river is quite narrow at this point, and its waters, when we arrived, were swift and tumultuous, running through a network of small islands loaded with snow and ice. On any wide stretch, the river was frozen to a considerable depth, and the current ran beneath the ice, giving off a strange, muffled noise. Our view was magnificent, a pale blue sky and a horizon marked by snow peaks, against which we could watch flights of eagles. For 2 months we enjoyed the agreeable change from the black and grey of a Ukrainian winter to the sportive landscape of eastern Galicia. Galician snows were also very heavy, and the cold was severe, but we slept in clean, heated barracks. Although an exaggerated sense of economy kept the heat at some 50 degrees or so, this at least enabled us to be fully alert when we were awake. Our camp was huge and organised with all the Prussian rigour of an army on the eve of battle. About 150 wooden buildings without floors had been built in blocks, carrying numbers and letters. Nearby, in the snow-covered woods, we could see a large stone building, which must have been part of the village beside the camp, and which housed our secretariat and principal officers. All our materiel had been repainted and overhauled. In these conditions of order and apparent abundance, none of us dreamed that Germany had reached the limit of its capacities. After the chaos of the front, the atmosphere of efficient organisation, with its requirement that every move be registered in writing, made us feel like wild beasts suddenly caged. The camp was built around a large central square for reviews and drills, in which young recruits were instructed in the art of manipulating arms, so useful in parades and so useless at the front. The young recruits seemed to enjoy these exercises. Others, like Howells and me, were seeing ourselves as we had been a year and a half ago, back in Poland, where we had handled explosives for the first time. The memory of those days seemed at least 10 years old. One ages quickly in wartime. Our world-weary attitude did not escape the attention of the young recruits, who responded by holding themselves even more stiffly, as if to show us that the war was now their affair. This healthy enthusiasm of schoolboys suddenly transformed into soldiers was destined to weaken somewhat after a few nights in the mud, and the shock of seeing a field hospital for the first time. We had been through all that. They would soon learn that war does not always create the same exaltation as the intoxicating explosion of the plaster grenades in the war games of training camp. The Führer, who was now scraping the bottom of the barrel, had been forced to send his arrogant Polizei off to war. These elderly new recruits were having a hard time of it. The sight of policemen crawling through the mud on their bellies delighted us enough so that we almost forgot our sufferings. Police officers, whose competence in war was limited, handed over their men to officers of the Wehrmacht, who put them through the works. This spectacle, which gave us so much pleasure, was hard on the eager young recruits, directly exposed to the bad humour of those bastards who did everything they could to keep the younger men in a state of inferiority. For us, life was also very far from perfect. Before settling into our new quarters, there had been a long and difficult journey. We had begun by tramping more than 30 miles on bad Russian roads, deeply rutted and coated with ice. Then we were loaded onto trucks and driven as far as Mogilev, an oriental-looking town, where we boarded 2 trains, both in very bad condition, for the remainder of the journey along the Bessarabian frontier to Lvov in Poland. From Lvov, trucks had brought us to the camp, where we had stumbled out, exhausted and filthy, under the suspicious gaze of polished, healthy officer instructors. We were allowed 48 hours to rest before our clothes and equipment had to be in perfect order. At our first inspection, the condition of our uniforms shocked the inspectors, although we had brushed and beaten them as hard as we could. They had completely lost their original colour and appearance. Grey-green had become greenish piss-yellow, decorated by tears and holes and reddish-brown burns. Our worn and crumpled boots had lost their black finish, and many were without heels or laces. We looked like a bunch of tramps, and the inspectors were ready to jump at the slightest sign of negligence. These evident traces of the battlefield struck them like slaps in the face, to which there was no answer. Those fops should, in fact, have been honouring us. They knew it too, and the knowledge irritated them. They persisted in picking on details to try to save face. A short way off, sections of police and students in camouflage uniforms were marching to their daily sweat baths, singing gaily in the dry, cold air, which had brought out the colour in their cheeks. Das schönste auf der Welt ist mein Tiroler Land. However, instead of the Alps, the Carpathians witnessed their compulsory gaiety. The instructors, intent on inspection, were insensible to the poetry of the scene. One of them stopped short in front of a Gefreiter, whose coat ended in a fringe as full of holes as a piece of Alençon lace. At last, the Stabsfeldwebel could unload a little rage in front of his sarcastic audience. Our heads turned slightly, scarcely noticeably, to the right, toward the fellow accused of negligence. We rolled our eyes as far as we could, trying to see who was getting it. "Name and number!" shouted the Stabs, stiffening his neck. Even if we couldn't see anything, we could hear it. "Frosch, Herr Stabsfeldwebel!" the accused shouted, adding the number which each of us was supposed to know by heart. Frosch. The name stirred an echo in my memory. Frosch? And then the barracks the day after we crossed the Dnieper came back to me. Hot water and a foolish-looking fellow of angelic goodwill. What was the Stabs going to pin on him? In the third row of men, some 10 or 12 yards from me, Frosch was standing at attention, while abuse rained down on him. He was staring straight ahead, as required by convention. His gaunt, hollow face was partly hidden by his heavy steel helmet. Unfortunately, his stupidity was obvious enough to give the Stabs a sudden sense of confident superiority over this soldier, who had clearly seen a lot. 2 large hands, red with chilblains, emerged from his ragged sleeves to press for warmth against the folds of filthy cloth. The coat no longer had any buttons. Frosch had fastened it at each buttonhole with a short piece of wire. With a touching sense of aesthetics, he had bent in the ends of each wire, as if to demonstrate his good intentions. Unfortunately, he had linked a lower buttonhole to a higher one, which produced an improper and all too visible crease. This anomaly leapt to the eye of the inspecting non-com, who couldn't let such a golden opportunity slip. However, in complete disregard of normal practice, the company officer intervened, reminding the Stabsfeldwebel that our detachment had just survived an extremely difficult experience. Your supply report specifically stated that you possessed the necessary materials for keeping your clothes in good repair, Herr Leutnant, and specifically mentioned buttons. The lieutenant didn't know how to answer. In addition, Herr Leutnant, Gefreiter Frosch hasn't even bothered to line up the buttonholes correctly. There was a moment of charged silence. The lieutenant threw Frosch a look of despairing compassion. Couldn't he have spared himself all this and deprived the instructor of this ludicrous opening? But the facts were as they were, and the lieutenant, despite all his goodwill, couldn't alter them. He resumed his former position with an impassive air. A wave of irritation seemed to run through the company. "Stillgestanden!" the Feld shouted. In a flood of gratuitous invective, Frosch was given 20 days' detention and a series of punitive fatigues. Without flinching, Frosch left his position to stand in the ranks of the guilty. He was the only one. The inspection was over. Quarter turn, left, left. Our companies went on to march around the camp. Frosch remained where he was, staring straight ahead. As the only man to be punished, he seemed a symbol of injustice, alone in his punishment, as he had always been in life. He had found some comradeship in the Wehrmacht, but the exigencies of military life exacted a high price. 10 days later, when the rest of the unit drew new clothes, Frosch kept his rags. He had in truth become a symbol. He didn't know how to hate and always wore his expression of touching stupidity and banal goodwill. Later the veteran said of him, "He's as humble as Diogenes. If he doesn't deserve victory, at least he deserves paradise." "Section forward, on the ground, on your feet, run, forward, on the ground, on your feet, facing me." The hard, frozen ground scraped our hands and knees, and the sharp twigs of the leafless scrub finished off our threadbare uniforms. They had put us through a series of exercises with concussion bombs. We, who had faced the fire of Russian Katyushas, just laughed. Then we had made ourselves as flat as the Ukrainian soil. Now we lay propped on one elbow, half amused, half exasperated. Our attitude provoked torrents of abuse and a collective punishment for the whole company. We had to crawl along the entire perimeter of the camp. The ground, 3 or 4 inches beneath our eyes, soaked up the muttered curses of our progress. The instructor non-coms were working hard, running along the carpet of soldiers. A short way off, Wesredar was watching this bad joke and arguing with the officers responsible for the camp. But he might as well have saved his breath. Orders from higher up had put an end to the coddling of troops just back from the front. We had to reinstate the rigidity of 40, 41, and wage war to the death. We went on long marches, carrying all our gear. We tramped through villages in step, singing. These demonstrations were intended to impress the local population, who, in fact, greeted us as we went by, the boys waving and the girls smiling. The routine never let up. We even had to practice retreating in a series of backward leaps, a skill which might always come in handy. Every 4th day we were free from 5 to 10 p.m. We flooded into Novotorechi and Sueka, 2 villages near the camp, where the peasants often invited us into their houses and gave us something to drink, and sometimes even to eat. Our soldiers quickly amused themselves with the girls, who were not shy. These few hours of liberty, used to the utmost, made us forget the rest. The following day we would return to the training routine. Despite the boredom, we cooperated, thinking that perhaps these were necessary measures.